Welcome back to segment 2 of track D, Real Disruption, How Technology is Changing and Challenging Real Estate. I'm pleased to welcome my friend, my colleague, and also my former professor, Professor David Gellner, who has, David, how long have you been at the center? Since 1990?
2002.
Oh, 2002. Sorry, I added 10 years. Since 2002, and for the alums who are here, we all know and love David. We've been through that. We've experienced real estate finance with David Gellner, year one. He's also the author of the Gellner and Miller finance book used in most of the programs around the country. So he's working on this great new program that I'm going to let him tell you about, and also introduce his guests. And we're delighted to have everybody here. Thank you.
Thanks. Actually, I don't need to use this mic, do I?
No, I don't think you do.
All right.
Okay, there we go.
So everybody can hear me? Yeah, it's my great pleasure to be here. I hope you're all enjoying the symposium. So I guess in some sense, a dream for me ever since I came here in 2002, a dream for me has been realized in this past year, because we launched a really fun and I think really important research platform. We simply call it the platform. There were so many labs here at MIT, we didn't want to create another lab. So we call it the Price Dynamics Platform, and it is about, well, what's our title here? Big, small, and smart data. So big data, yeah, lots of data. We're all excited about that these days. But really where it matters for decision-making purposes in real estate, especially commercial real estate, investment real estate, in many cases we still have small data. When you drill down to the micro level where it really matters, individual sub-markets in sub-areas of a metro area, there's not that many transactions. So we still need to be really good at small data. And smart data, it's actually, we were just talking, it's actually not the data that's smart, it's these guys who are smart. And so with this platform, which has been made possible by Real Capital Analytics, Bob is really an incredible visionary and pioneer in this industry who is creating a revolution by getting us the kind of data in the way that we need, and then having the vision and the excitement to come to a place like us to bring cutting-edge econometricians with really specialized expertise that's like just perfectly targeted for real estate, for commercial real estate, like Alex Van de Minne. And then even going beyond the US and beyond the developed world to even hugely important emerging market countries that are leapfrogging us in many ways. India. So this is the kind of thing that we're bringing together with this research platform. So we don't need to limit our discussion here to just this platform, but we thought we would at least take a fair amount of the time here for each of these people to give you a brief perspective on something related to the platform. In the case of Bob, who will go first, he's not only the benefactor of this platform, but his data, the Real Capital Analytics data, is really the heart and the seed of this platform. And then we'll have Raja Sitharavam, who is putting India on the forefront of really high quality data and ability to have modern international quality real estate investment in India. And then we'll have Alex talk about one project in particular that's of interest that'll give you an idea of the kind of things we do in the platform. So trying to think if there's anything else I was going to mention in my highly formal notes here. Oh yeah, I have a little sermon that I give. So, the real estate investment industry, like any industry, has a very strong existing culture. And that culture grew out of and is based on a time when there was hardly any good data and not much good theory or analytics applied to that data. So it is a culture that is basically a culture of telling stories. And who tells the best stories is going to get the deals. And nobody can ever call them on the carpet because we didn't have the data to really see what was really going on. And that's the culture of this industry. And we're not going to change that business culture among the boomers, the people in my generation. But cultures change with generations. And who we're teaching now, and for the past several years, maybe even since I've been here since 2002, we're teaching a new generation. And it's a new world because of the things that people like these guys have been doing. And I do think we have the opportunity to to revolutionize the culture of the real estate investment industry. And that's the kind of thing that MIT is all about. So what we're doing here is hugely exciting and fun and important. And with that, Bob, why don't you tell us a little bit, whatever you want to.
All right. Thank you, David. So with the title Big Data, Small Data, Smart Data, I've had a number of debates with people about, is there really big data in commercial real estate? And at least my world, where I follow transactions, I'd argue not so much. We might track 100,000 significant property transactions around the globe on an annual basis. And that's just not a lot. I mean, other markets you can see 100,000 transactions every minute. So we're not talking about huge amounts of data. I won't say small data, but I will say that I picked our commercial property price indices because I think it is, being really smart with the data. And it's also been an endeavor that we've done jointly with MIT for over a decade, I guess about a dozen years now, that we started playing around with repeat sales, transaction-based repeat sales in the commercial real estate markets. And we launched the first repeat sale transaction-based price index for commercial property in late 2006. And at the time, I think it was 28 indices, maybe 32, it was somewhere around there in total. And they were the first in the industry, and they were all for the US. And most of them were national sector or regional sector-based indices. And it was quite an accomplishment. Since then, in working together, we've continually improved it. We're now on our third iteration. The last iteration, which was the most substantial change that I'm going to talk about, we launched this past fall. And that was probably at least 2 years of combined work. It was David and Alex, Mark Franke, who was here, my team, Jim Sempery and Elizabeth, and a number of others sitting around, meeting regularly, and looking at a lot of squiggly lines, as we like to say. But it's a real advancement. I think David, I believe it was David that said it's the advancements that we've made in repeat sales technology is like going from a propeller plane to a jet. So now we have over 350 indices, and actually we can create very specific indices, so it's almost unlimited. Whereas the first generation included just US indices, and the second iteration we had some UK indices. We now have indices for 15 different countries, pretty much covering about 80% of all the transaction or the investable universe in the institutional real estate markets. So we're very proud of that. And so for the first time, we can look at pricing trends in all these global markets on a comparable basis. And the problem with repeat sales, as we found early on, and it's, I thought it was an obstacle that we probably could never overcome. I never dreamed that we could even be able to produce an index for France, much less Paris, was the scarcity of data and the number of observations available to us. Because it takes a pair of transactions, you have to have a good price on each transaction. It has to exceed other filters, and once all that's done, you come down to relatively few data points. But with the new technology, that we created. So this is the basic repeat sales model. This is taking a handful of sales of the same building over in London, central London, over the cycle, and it just shows you kind of how the basic repeat sales model works. So a few years ago, Alex came around and he and David started talking about some ideas and introduced us to, at least me, to Bayesian thinking, and we've been able to do some amazing things. This is what the standard repeat sales model would give you as far as an index based on, this is just the office sector in LA County. So over about a decade, there are only about 400 observations, which is not a lot. And the standard framework gave you a very erratic index and some false reads. This is a recursive looking back quarterly for about a decade. That's clearly not a reliable index. So introducing this Bayesian framework, structured time series, stochastic volatility, just a number of things that I can really only say what they are. I don't know what they mean. But you can immediately see the results. So, I wouldn't even say smooth, because it's smoothing implies lag, and there's no introduction of lag into these indices. It creates much more accurate indices that don't get fooled by aberrations in the data, particularly at periods, like we saw at the depths of the GFC, where there are very few observations available. It produces very accurate indices. The backwards revisions is greatly minimized. Now, that may just seem like a statistical goal for us to want to conquer, but we actually created these indices to facilitate a derivatives market in real estate. And backward revisions is a very difficult thing to overcome if you're pricing a financial instrument. And although a derivatives market is still in the offering for this biggest asset class that you still can't hedge, we have maintained and we keep these indices to that rigor to be tradable someday. And that could be truly revolutionary for the industry. But for now, they're very valuable information products. And as I said, we have tremendous number available to us. So these are a number of the global cities in comparison to each other, basically on the same scale. You can see Hong Kong goes off the scale. We have metro indices, and we can actually get to the CBD cores of many markets. And you can see, just looking at those dashed lines compared to the metro areas, that's been one of the biggest trends over the past 8 years since the recovery of the GFC, is a focus on urban core investment and the price appreciation in these urban cores compared to even the metro levels. Or we have to have country indices, and all these global cities outperformed by far the overall countries. So it's taken a lot of work to be able to produce all these squiggly lines, but there is a lot of meaning to them. And it really helps in conveying trends, whether you're just looking at other metrics in the market. So this is, I love bubble charts. For anybody that knows me, I use a lot of bubble charts. But this has volume change on the x-axis and price change measured by the indices on the y-axis. Now these bubbles are scaled in relative size of the investment market. And this shows you what's going on in the current market. The German A cities are on fire. Hong Kong's on fire. Amsterdam, which has been slow to recover and almost overlooked, all of a sudden investors have realized that arbitrage opportunity and been bidding that up. Whereas, markets that had been seeing the greatest price appreciation over the past 10 years and even over the past 5 years, New York's, London's, Paris, have starting to see the market slow. It's really interesting when you look at this grid right now, how many markets are on this upper left-hand quadrant. And that's an interesting area. I mean, clearly, if you're in the upper right-hand quadrant, everything's golden. If you're in the lower left-hand quadrant, everything's bad. You're typically in a recession. There's a lot of different reasons a property can be in that upper left-hand quadrant. And that's some of the next steps in our research. And There's already a paper that David and Alex and another researcher out of Amsterdam called Dorant, what's Dorant's last name? I can't pronounce it. Has been producing about using these indices to gauge supply and demand in a marketplace. So there are a couple of reasons something could be in the upper left-hand quadrant. It could be that's just cooling and it's starting to fall into a recession, or it could be like Sydney. Prices are rising so fast that there's not much available to buy in that marketplace. Sellers are saying, well, gosh, if prices are going up that fast, why should I sell now? So they're supply constrained in terms of offering. So, they're both good and bad reasons to be in that quadrant, and hopefully we'll be able to separate out and designate which markets are there for positive reasons and which are on the downturn. So that's something that we can look forward to. And then we can also use these indices and take all these global markets, which are really tough to compare, using a price per square foot or even cap rate, and look at it at different time periods and compare it to other economic benchmarks. So this is actually another bubble graph that we just published this past week. So this is 5-year employment growth, annual compound growth, and the change in the CPPI for all these global markets. And you can see the correlation is quite high, but you can also see that there are quite a few outliers. So in some cases, these may be investment opportunities, and some it may be highlighting markets that may be overpriced relative to economic growth. And these are things that would be very, very tough, if not impossible, to convey with anything other than an index. And it has been, and hopefully it's a great example of the collaboration between industry and the MIT Center. As I said, it's over a decade long. I think we're all very proud of these indices. These slides actually came, except for this one, from a presentation that Alex and I gave earlier this year to the ECB. So they're getting quite a bit of attention. And quite frankly, I think it's only the beginning of additional research on the indices. So with that, I want to thank David especially for over decades of innovation, and Alex for the most recent Bayesian input. And I'd like to turn it over to Raja. Thank you.
Right. Yeah, why don't we...
Oh, you want to introduce it?
I think we'll just roll through each of these presentations. Raja, you can feel free to introduce yourself. Sure. And after the three, then we'll open it up for big discussion. Right.
Yep. Thank you. I was on the panel last year as well, and I spoke about how India is becoming more transparent. It's much more transparent than probably the United States. I'll give you the examples as to how we are more transparent. But it's been a pleasure working with David and Alex and Bob as well. So let me give you. Gotta go behind. Right, I'll give you a little bit of introduction about PropStack. So we started 5 years back, and we are currently the largest real estate data and analytics player in India. What that means is, we are CoStar and CompStack and TREP put together, right? So we have every sale, lease, and mostly the mortgage transactions which get registered onto our system. And what we do is we build analytics around it because government data is pretty much raw. That helps you make predictive and prescriptive decision making. We started with CRE data, and we expanded over time to building the largest developer database platform in India. And right now, we're working on multifamily and residential. So that pretty much covers all the asset classes in India. And we think, as I go forward in my presentation, I will show you as to the elaborate data sets that we're covering and helping in the industry as a whole to make decisions in India and otherwise. Most of our products are cloud-based. It's easy to use anywhere, anytime. And we also help you export the data through and integrate the data through APIs to build much more intelligent data sets. So you can combine it with, for example, you can combine our data with RCA data, and create a much more bigger and broader and more intelligent database, right? So if you're sitting in the US and want to take decisions, you just need to kind of work on some of the data sets, and depending on any kind of permutation and combination, it will give you those kind of decision-making tools and database, right? So just to talk about, there are various surveys that get carried over the years and says that, India is one of the most opaque countries in the world. And while I was on the panel last year, I said that, we, from the 150th opaque country across the world, we came down to 35. I can say with a great deal of conviction that we are amongst the top 5 transparent economies, right? We recently completed the largest digitization exercise in the world, where we issued ID cards to 1.2 billion citizens, right? That is the single largest digitization initiative. And that is slowly getting percolated and expanded to the real estate world. Right now, the government has undertaken an initiative to make title, the real estate title itself, transparent, and that in itself, and they are involving blockchain initiatives, so on and so forth. So while that is a little gradual, there's a lot of momentum, in making data transparent. And why would the government may take such an initiative? Because it helps them in tax collections, it helps them in revenue generation, and so on and so forth. So it's a very natural process that the more transparent the data becomes, the more the ecosystem develops and the economy develops, right? But coming back as to how we get this data is because registration of any kind of transactions in India is a state subject, and it's got to be done to make it a legally valid document. So what we do as a company is we track these registrations online and offline. So India is a very large country. Every state is in itself like a mini country. So the rules that govern different states is not consistent, right? So which is why some of the states are digitized, whereas the others are still offline in the nature of how they record these transactions. What we've been able to build is a platform which pulls out digital records, and we use a lot of machine learning and algorithms to basically clean up their entire data and present it in a manner that it is usable to our clients. And in states which are not digitized, the hard copies are actually scanned. Again, we use machine learning techniques, and we make it a digitized document, and then the data that comes out of it, the cleansing process, it gives you a great deal of information which is useful for your decision making, right? And like I said, our data involves a mix of machine learning and human intervention. So coming back to the main question as to why do you need like a rent index? Because that's the single largest denominator which tells you the value of the underlying asset, right? It tells you about how the asset is being used, how the occupancy is being done, and over time, it's very different than the asset pricing, right? The sale pricing, that's different than the rental. The rental index gives you a lot of more depth in terms of, what kind of transformation an asset has been undergoing over a period of time. And which is why we say the space market is very different than the asset market. And there are various types of indexes that have been available. You have the Shilling Index, the RCA Index, some of the others, but those are all for the sale pricing and not for the rental pricing. So we could be amongst the first who have done the index over repeatable rental information, right, over the same units. So basically the rents are determining, how the productivity of the building itself is over a period of time, and gives you a good indicator as to how that stock is holding in terms of the comparable stock in the other micro markets. So if you were to compare across countries as to what are the major constraints, data is extremely opaque, right? I mean, it's not available in most countries. But imagine and these are private contracts. So if I were to give you an example in the US, you have companies which are tracking sale data. but the rent data is not registered. It's not in the public domain, right? And which is why they're crowdsourced. They're based on hearsay. Whereas, in India, these have to be registered. The difficult part in India is to get access to the data, because every government data is raw in nature. So you initially, and there are lots of systematic errors, technology errors, clerical errors. So first is the access to the data itself, and then when you export it to a database, we've got to cleanse it, and then kind of build analytics around it, right? So that's what we've done, and the constraint in creating rent indexes is typically, buildings differ from each other. The timelines of the rent, the duration is different, and over a period of time, the rent for a particular building does not necessarily determine as to how it has behaved because of various factors that has gone. And the long-term nature of the commercial leases does not necessarily reflect the market conditions. For example, if there's a particular transaction which is done at a period of time, and if you were to compare 10 years down the line, it does not necessarily reflect unless you have the same rent for the same unit over a period of time. So you cannot jump over a long period to determine the rent for that particular unit. So, while we try to create, these indices, we had a lot of challenges because in the past, most of these indexes were created by survey-based and hearsay because the data itself was not available. So, and contract rents on new leases are typically not public, across the world. So it is only, in India. I mean, we've been able to procure this and create it and showcase it in a manner that it makes sense, for decision making. And our data is really built on actual contract rent. We don't work on hearsay or any kind of external kind of factor. We have an underlying agreement for every rental term that comes into play into creating the index. And because it's a state requirement, our data is only getting stronger by the day because we're getting more and more data, and we're able to build a more robust model around the index itself. In terms of the office markets, why is our index can be a barometer to understand the office markets? Because this is really a new methodology than what has been developed in the past. Because these are based on actual rents, actual agreements. We've done pseudo rent repetitions over the same unit, which means a particular unit which was leased out at a particular period of time. We have similar rent for that unit over the next 10 years. And that gives you a very accurate trend as to how the market has evolved. And this method can be utilized not only for commercial, but also for residentials, right? So it's universally applicable. And when we put it through stress test or a small sample or different types of heterogeneity of the market itself, it came out strong, and it was comparable to how the market is evolving or behaving in the mature economies as well. So the resultant effect of the indices is, it was consistent with the other findings, from the central bank or the economic factors and all of that, where we saw the IT capital of India has a maximum increase, at a pace of about 5% on a year-on-year increase. The tier 2 cities also increased by about 2.5 to 3%, and we believe that despite the sample being slightly smaller than what we may have wanted, it stood well in the stress test, and the underlying what it showcased is even in an emerging market like India, we could produce data and index similar to what's being done in the mature economies like the US, and and we think going forward, I think this would be very useful in understanding as to how the space behaves, how the rental market behaves, and especially when you have sovereign funds and pension funds putting in long-term capital into a country, they rely on this kind of data and the trend. We think it'll be very useful, and that's where the RUPD platform fits in perfectly to fulfill the needs of the venture capital and the large private equity players. And we think that combined with the estimates of the indices, researchers can also analyze changes in things like market volatility and some of the other complicated factors. So we're not stopping at this. It's not only the CRE market that we're trying to address. Like I said, we're doing a rather creative product on the mortgages, developer mortgages, and we're getting into multifamily and residential as well. And the best part is, like I said, we take data from the government, and we are analyzing it and giving it back to the government. As a long-term play, what we intend to do is include MIT and work with the government itself in creating various policy initiatives. And that's a larger goal, and probably we aim that could be the single largest probably initiative for this data platform as far as India is concerned, right? This is some of how the markets behaved, very consistent with some of the other findings that we've had from the central government or the Central Bank of India, where the markets are moving in a particular direction for tier 1 and tier 2 cities across quarters, essentially, over a period of time since 2010, we've been able to track all these records and the movements very accurately based on registered agreements in India. And we think this is only going to get more robust and solid going forward.
Great. Thanks, Raja. So that's an example of the kind of work that we're doing in this platform. And then I'm happy to introduce Dr. Alex Vandemenne, who's a research scientist that the center here at MIT has engaged to head up this platform. So Alex is really the head of the platform and genius behind a lot of this stuff. But he only speaks Dutch and Bayesian.
I try my best at English as well, but there we go. So yeah, maybe a quick introduction of what we do at the Price Dynamics platform. I know people already talked about it a little bit, but we like to work with industry, especially like to work with industry if you have data. And we also want to know, if you have data and you have very specific questions, please come to us, and usually we are able to help you. And what we then do is we try to, throw all the academic rigor at it that we can. We'll present it on conferences, the research we do. We'll make it available on SSRN or on our website. I'll get back at our website a little bit. And that way, you can pick it up and run with it for your own company. That's exactly what RCA did with the indexes, price indexes. You can actually find the methodology online. We're really open about this. We're not trying to hide anything. And the same with Raja. You can find everything online. The entire methodology is there. So, of course, you don't have the data. That's their advantage. But that's typically the way we work. So, obviously, I forgot my own business cards, but please, at the end, give me yours. So my talk's going to be indeed again about the smart data concept, where also David already said it's actually more about smart people than data. And I do think it's important because a lot of people talk about big data, but I don't think, and this comes back a little bit to what Bob said, that in commercial real estate will ever is a big word, but it will take a long time before we have big data, because data is basically a matrix, right? You can go down, typically we call that the N dimension, and you can go sideways, which is the K dimension, so how many variables do you have? The problem is with commercial real estate, we typically want to know the market information, and you only get it at transactions. But CRE simply isn't sold that often. So I think that RCA has a capture rate of 90% in their market. So, okay, we can bring it to 100%, but that's still not a lot of data. So typically, if people talk about big data in CRE, they usually talk about this K dimension, so finding explanatory variables. So this can be anything from just how big is a property, well, RCA of course has that, to maybe something like what is the view from any given room. But we actually found that that typically if you put like a lot of variables in these models tend to become very unstable. And then there's ways to solve that, but typically it doesn't end nice necessarily. So I'm also not really a believer of just throwing in as many variables in there as you can. I'm not saying that it's not useful, but I think it's especially useful if you want to find causal relationships, which is important mainly for academics, or maybe if you're a policymaker, then having very specific variables can be really important. But for the products that we talk about, typically you don't need it. And we use something, well, I call it the latent models. And I'm not going to explain what it is, so it's a bit of a cliffhanger, but it would take a bit too much time. But basically, you're trying to produce something that's not there, but the thing that you produce actually helps you explain stuff. The problem there is that in academia, not that many people use it because it doesn't explain anything. And in industry, people aren't using it yet as much because these models tend to be really complicated. We already heard the word Bayesian, it's very specific. You can't estimate these with standard OLS models anymore. But it's changing. People like Bob is in the forefront and Raja now, and we have other companies that are really interested in the stuff that we are doing. So I quickly want to show a few examples of what we do, and then I want to take some time to look at a specific project, which I think is more, makes sense at the World Economic Real Estate Forum. So these are actually forecasts. This is for Dallas Commercial. We did numerous cities. And for example, one of the things we said, well, a standard forecasting model will give you the red line just prior to the crisis. So we pretend we're in the crisis. The full line is actually the RCA CPPI that you can download from the website if you're a member. And the red line is what a normal forecasting model would have said at that point in time. Makes sense. It looks at its own history. It says it's going up, so it thinks it will be going up. Those other lines are different iterations of our forecasting model. Our latent, it's actually a dynamic factor model. And you can see that we were pretty spot on, right? And so that's fun for research, but then what we do is we actually use it to forecast the RCA CPPIs. And these are actually freely available to you guys on a website that I'm going to show at the end of our presentation. So we actually do something with it ourselves. These are like land prices. That's something that interests us as well. This is then in Atlanta for apartment and commercial. Commercial, because apartment's actually also commercial because it's multifamily units. Commercial would mean office, retail, industrial combined. Together with the CPPIs, again from RCA, you can see that our land prices are more volatile but also have higher returns, which sort of makes sense. So this is typically also the stuff that we do over here. This is actually the investors' demand and supply indexes that Bob shortly talked about. So this is for New York City. It's where we look at the reservation prices of buyers versus sellers. This also tells you something about liquidity. And indeed, what we're finding is that before there was way more demand, like supply couldn't keep up with demand in New York. But we're actually sort of in an equilibrium now. So I'm not saying this is bad. This actually means that sort of liquidity is aligned. Demand and supply at the moment is aligned in New York. But this is a new status quo. We haven't seen that in a long while, right? And just prior to the crisis, it's also really predictive because just before the crisis, you can see actually that demand already started to plummet. But the sellers' reservation prices were still pretty high because they were sort of ignoring the fact that there was a crisis going on. So they kept the reservation price high, meaning that liquidity plummeted, and actually that resulted in a crisis. So there's also some predictive capacity in here. These are also freely available for you, at least part of it, not the full history, but I'll get back at that. So again, now I want to go to our a more specific project that we're working on at the moment. It's really much in progress, yes. It's actually Yangtze over here. She is actually the main author on this, so any applaud you have on this topic, it's actually for her. And so what we wanted to do here is just look at land prices in China, and not just one city, we mean the entire country. In case you didn't know, it's a big country, so we use a lot of data. And what we wanted to look is over the last 10 years or so, how did land prices change, but on a parcel level. So for every parcel, we have a value, but also for every time period, we have a value. So, and we can produce these maps. Again, it's still work in progress. To click the play button. Yeah, okay, here you go. So here, this is like Hong Kong and Guangzhou. Hong Kong actually is now out of this picture. I'll tell you a little bit why. But you can see like how did land values like change over time, and we do this for all these areas. I think the next one. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh yeah, and this is the Yangtze River Delta. So yeah, so sorry. The reason I skipped Hong Kong is because the values are so high over there is that it sort of dwarfed all the other bars. But Hong Kong is in there as well. This is here for, here's Shanghai. So we do the same thing, and we're actually planning on doing this for all the cities in China, and it gives you pretty accurate. And we also want to like interpolate it to all the other land parcels. So basically, what we'll get is a full automated valuation models of every single land parcel in China. That's actually the goal that we want to end up with. So yeah, these are just a few examples of what we do. We, of course, do a lot more. We actually look at automatic valuation models. We're also interested in development projects. We do all that stuff. We have a lot of people working with us, for us, whatnot. And most of it is still on RCA data. Even this is actually RCA data. They also have a lot of dev sites in China. But yeah, we're open to other data sources as well. And actually, that brings me to my final point, is we just now, for this occasion, launched our website, which I think works like this, yeah. So it's the price dynamics platform.mit.edu, and you'll find our team, the people who work here, and you'll find our papers over here. You can also find them on SSRM, by the way. We have something on the historic performance of green properties, etc. Some other things on here. Interesting, you can look at it, but the real pièce à la résistance is on the analytics part, is where we actually have a couple of products that we try to update regularly, as much as possible as we can in our capacity. At the moment, we have 3 products on here. We're trying to expand it, so I can't say anything about it yet because it's not done yet. But so we have like a total return index for a selection of metro areas in the United States. We have the forecast that I mentioned. You can download them, you can use them, and again, it's freely available. Just go to our website. And we have these investor supply and demand indexes. I just showed New York, but we also have a couple of other metro areas on there. So we're really happy with it. It's just 3 products at the time. Try to update them as much as possible. If you're on like the MIT CRE mailing list, I suppose you'll get an update whenever we update the products. We haven't actually figured that one out yet, but we'll get to that. And otherwise, please contact us directly, and we'll make sure that you're updated if you're interested in one of these products. And I think that's it for me. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, so actually, let me just, before we open it up, let me just carry this on a little. So forecast, you guys are all interested in our forecasts, right? So, and you can see the URL here is just Price Dynamics Platform, all one word, .mit.edu. And you go to the analytics page and you want to see our forecasts. Should work, right? So we forecast what? 28 markets, 28 CPPIs. So the RCA CPPIs track property transaction prices based on repeat sales. These forecast those CPPIs for the next 2 years, quarterly. And here we're ranking the ones that we forecast. And what's coming out on top? Now, we didn't rig this. Boston apartments. We're forecasting what? Now this is cumulative over 2 years, right? So we're forecasting about 20% growth in Boston apartment property asset prices, unlevered, over the next 2 years, right? So yeah, everybody go out and buy a Boston apartment, because that's just the price change. That you're also going to get some yield, some income. So, but this just gives you an example of how this works. So at this point, we would like to open this up for discussion. Anything you guys want to talk about, probably relating to big or small data, or smart econometricians. How does this work? Do we have microphones? Or Weija is going to run to anybody who has a question. Or we can probably don't even need a microphone. You can probably, not that big of a room. Gosh. Were we speaking too technically, or you guys just all bedazzled, or is it indeed 3:30 in the afternoon? Right.
Yeah, so I was trying not to talk about it, and that's like always a problem because people then will ask, well, actually, what is it? And yeah, so geez, how do I explain it? Well, maybe for the forecasting, I think there the intuition can help. I'll try to explain as easy as I can, but the problem is that with real estate, we know that real estate co-moves, right? So what you would want to do is you want to have basically a regression where you would have the CPPI of, let's say, Boston apartments on the left-hand side. You want to try to explain it with all these factors, right? And then you can use it to forecast. Well, the problem is what factors are there? And also, for example, we would like to have the other CPPIs on the right-hand side because they co-move. So there's probably information in like New York apartment that can help us predict Boston apartment. But the problem is like RCA has 350 indexes. So then we get one index and then 350 indexes on the right-hand side times some lags. That would mean we have to estimate, I believe we calculated, we would have like 35,000 parameters or something. What these dynamic vector models do is they basically look at all the RCA CPPIs and they reduce it to just four common trends. What these common trends are, we have no idea, but these are sort of commonalities that run through all those 350, actually we did it just in the US, so then it's slightly less, but for all those like 100 indexes, there's like four common components that always come back, like 4 time series. Again, we have no idea what they represent. They might represent interest rates, they might represent a mix of a few variables, and then we use those hidden, latent indexes, we use those as explanatory variables on the right-hand side, which is very parsimonious use of data, and it works really well. I mean, the proofs in the pudding, we're not the first ones to do it like this, or especially central banks have used it as well. So yeah, that's sort of, and we sort of do it with all these types of models. We have tricks like that. So.
But nobody has done this kind of modeling for real estate before.
No. Well, like the dynamic vector model, actually, again, it's just one of the models we use, but they actually came from central banks where, like Ben Bernanke is one of the guys who advanced the field the most. He published a lot on dynamic vector model. But like in the 50s, if you had to say like, what is the economy doing? You would only have 4 or 5 time series. You didn't have that much data. But by now, these central banks have hundreds and hundreds of time series. So if they quickly want to look at what's happening overall, they use these models to sort of summarize all those time series into just like 2, 3, or 4 common trends, even though they might not even know, again, what they represent, but it gives them a feeling of things going up or things going down. So the dynamic vector model specifically came from central banks, but this entire Bayesian way of thinking, of course, mainly comes from NASA, from space travel, because, if a rocket goes up and it goes to the moon, you have to steer the vehicle, and Houston helps them there, but if they send back the signal, it bounces off on all the dust particles. So if you would literally look at where the aircraft is, if you're in Houston, you would see jump around all the time. So they made these models which can actually extract the signal from the noise and say, no, the rocket's actually here. And that's the same methodology we use for their repeat sale models with RCA. We basically use this type of navigational Kalman filtering, Bayesian type of thinking.
Rocket science.
Yeah.
Bob, do you want to respond first, and then we'll circle back to the previous?
Okay, well, I think we all have a response because we've sat around and we've debated and had a lot of discussion about CapEx and depreciation. So, on the flip side of the CapEx argument is the indices are actually not incorporating, depreciation.
Right.
And, but we do have certain filters to make sure, any CapEx doesn't change the use or size of the property. We have extreme return filters so that, if returns exceed a certain threshold, which would indicate probably, significant CapEx well beyond the typical, get flattened out. And to some extent, it's a price index, so it reflects movement of price, so you can't get all of it out. But, given the heterogeneity of the asset class, it's about as like kind as you can get. But that is somewhat of an issue, but for the most part, I'd basically say the standard amount, the average amount of CapEx is in, most of the data points there.
One of the beauties of the repeat sale methodology is it directly tracks the experience of the investor. Right? The investor buys a property, and they've got to sell that same property later on at some price, and that's exactly what we're measuring. We have done some studies, and if you take out the CapEx, or actually if you take out the effect of CapEx, but you also take out the effect of net depreciation, because even after expending CapEx, properties still depreciate. If you take out both those two things, neither of which is in the is taken out in the index, you end up almost where you started, because they kind of offset each other. So that makes the indexes pretty meaningful, I think. Your other part of your question is very interesting, because it's about sort of capital market theory and whether and how these indexes relate to risk and return. So when you're looking at the spread and whether real estate is sort of fairly priced and it's providing its fair return, you really need to consider total returns, not just the price change, right? Because the investor gets return from both income and capital gain, and that's a lot of the motivation underlying this other product that we have, these total returns. And just to show you what that looks like, we do for, again, a number of these markets. Is it the same 28 markets?
Mm-hmm. 26, actually.
We enhance the RCA CPPI price change indexes with, I think, some pretty sophisticated estimates of the income component of the return to create a total return index. But beyond that, and this is what we're kind of probably, no, I think we'll have time for another question, but I want to note that we have over a dozen research projects recently completed, underway, various stages of production in the platform. I'd say that Alex is involved in all of them. I'm involved in some of them. We have a number of research affiliates. We have Professor Mark Frank from University of Amsterdam. We have, obviously, Raja and Bob. They both have been involved in papers. Research. We have Professor John Clapp from University of Connecticut. We have Professor Chihiro Shimizu from Nihon University in Japan. So it's not just us. Sherry Bokhari, who's recently moved to Redfin, but he has been involved in work. And if you go to the papers heading of the website, many of these, the ones that are at the stage of having, how's this work? Having a working paper are available to be downloaded here. And I would point out one of them in particular that is a completed paper. We have the quantile paper on here.
No, because it's published.
All right, well, so that's one that's already gone through the pipeline and it's already published in the Journal of Portfolio Management. Is one of our first projects was to analyze total returns of different price points of commercial property, investment property. So looking at the indexes of total returns of high-priced properties, medium-priced properties, low-priced properties, over time, so we can see the total return and the volatility. And indeed, that's the kind of thing we can look at spreads and capital markets and how the risk and return plays out. And we found a very interesting result, which is that the low price point properties, the relatively smaller properties that tend to be in relatively less valuable locations, seem to provide a higher risk-adjusted return. So they provide almost the same price growth, but with higher yield, so higher total return and less volatility. And they're lagged in time, so they're more predictable. So the large properties, the high-priced properties that are traded by the sophisticated investors, they move first. They seem to reflect information quicker, but they also show more risk. So, Steve, do we have time for one more question, or what's our? Okay, I think in the back there. So we are tracking, so what came out on top was Boston Apartments, not Boston Commercial. We are tracking, it's the RCA database, so it's basically, Bob, you can tell more about the nature of the apartments.
It's just rental apartments, 10 units and greater.
So yeah, it's other than the really small mom and pop stuff, it's all the private apartment buildings in Boston. Right.
Yes.
Right, and it's not value weighted. It's transaction weighted basically. So it's reflecting. It's not overly dominated by the really big properties.
We actually saw that, I think it was Zillow, or maybe Redfin, I think it was Zillow, they also make predictions of single-family housing in Boston, and they also predicted a similar growth, actually, for single-family Boston housing.
Yeah.
I mean, I saw it, I live here, I saw it in my rent.
Yeah, people who live in Boston, that we have a housing supply shortage, especially of rental housing. So
They're building a new apartment tower over there that's going to solve
there you go. Yeah, I mean, you can pick up an apartment over there in that tower for $6 million, as low as $6 million.
One more question?
Yeah.
Question back here.
Yeah.
The trend line, let's say 10-year trend line is going to be 3% per year. Then I take your data, resale, fair resale, 2 years, it shows about 10%. So I'm going to project 1 year. Which one would I use?
Well, you have to remember over the past 10 years, there was never a normal period. Everything just plummeted and came back up, and so I think the most recent 2 years is probably a better indicator. But things are changing right now. The markets that have been the hottest are really starting to slow. In fact, our Manhattan and Central London indices posted slight declines this past quarter. The first time this cycle. San Francisco also starting to see some cooling. Central Sydney, all these markets that have been really on fire, except for Hong Kong, are stumbling a bit. I mean, it's just one quarter. It's not a trend yet, but I think it's significant that we're seeing so many of these markets, slow, and others kind of more secondary or overlooked markets taking over in terms of growth.
Yeah, actually, our forecasts also show that we put it in writing in a report, but almost all the markets, I think, except for Boston Apartment, again, the only exception, we see that our 2-year projection is less than the 2 years that were before it. So we also, our forecasts also say it's not going down. It's only 1 or 2 markets where we actually think it's going down. And it's like Chicago, who cares? But but yeah. So we also see a cooling, and we also think it has to do with the supply and demand. There's some puzzle pieces. They're everywhere, but if you pull them together, it's quite a consistent.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And with that, thank you very much to Professor David Gellner, to Rama, Bob, thank you. Alex, thank you. And they'll be here to answer some follow-up questions. We have a 15-minute break, and then we're back for the Design X Showcase for startups here at MIT, which is always great. If you were here last year for it, it was really good.